my name is Andrew Filar, and I'm here today to talk about salary caps in sports. So mostly what I'm going to be focusing on is competitive balance in sports and how a salary cap affects competitive balance. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the background on salary caps, what they are, the different types of salary caps we have, how they came about, and whether or not they actually work. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the background, and then I'm going to give you two case studies. The first case study is going to be on a league with a salary cap, and the second case study is going to be on a league without a salary cap. And we're going to get a little bit of scientific data from what economists believe about salary caps, and then I'm going to make a recommendation over whether or not I believe salary caps have a place in sports. So to get started, we'll talk about what a salary cap is. A salary cap is essentially a limit or cap to how much a team can spend on a player's salaries in a given year. Typically is dictated by the collective bargaining agreement that league has entered into with the Players Association. So when looking at a salary cap, there's two types of caps to look at. There's a hard cap, which means that it's pretty much set in stone, it's very strictly enforced, and you have a maximum amount of money you can spend on a player, no ifs, ands, or buts. If you were to go over this limit, you could be faced with penalties such as fines, forfeiture of draft picks, forfeiture of wins, voiding of contracts, all types of bad things that you don't want happening to your team, especially if you've been successful to date. The second type of cap that we can see is called a soft cap. And what a soft cap essentially is a type of salary cap where you have an amount that you can spend every single year, but there's loopholes and there's opportunities to kind of get around it. So one example of this can be seen in the NFL. A lot of people think that the NFL is actually a hard cap, but it's not. It's a soft cap because of the bonus system, right? So, for instance, this year we have $123 million that we can spend as an NFL team on player salaries, but if for some reason you need to spend more than that, you could incentivize these players to come to your team by putting a player bonus in. Now, the way the structure works is that if you put a bonus in on the contract, you don't have to give the full amount in 1 year. So say you have, let's just call him Tom Brady. He signs a new contract for $10 million a year, but $8 million of that is a bonus, meaning that only $2 million is going to count against the cap. Now, for that $8 million, they could count it all as a cap against 1 year, or they could prorate it over the life of the entire contract of 7 years. So his cap hit would be, $2 million on his base salary plus $1.3 million would be the remainder of that bonus over the 7 years. And it allows the NFL to get around the hard cap and kind of manipulate the data, so to speak, so they can spend more money than the actual cap allows. So another type of soft cap can be seen in the NBA or the MLB with a luxury tax, meaning the NBA has a cap, but if you were to go over the cap, you would have to pay a luxury tax, and same thing in the MLB where there's no cap, but if you go over $175 million, you're going to have to pay a pretty large penalty that's going to go towards player benefits. So salary caps, the way they came about typically involved money, and typically any type of dispute you have over the salary cap is still going to deal with money to this day. In the NHL, they didn't get it until about 2004, 2005. There was no cap until that point. In the NFL, it was 1994. The NBA, 1985. And the MLB still has no cap to this day. Now, one of the relationships that I found in my research is that typically when free agency comes along, that's when collective bargaining agreements and salary caps come into play. Prior to getting the salary cap in almost all of these leagues, players weren't allowed to have free movement of their services, so they were essentially stuck on one team getting paid a small amount of money. So of course, naturally they weren't very happy about it. So they were on strike, or there was an owner's lockout, so to speak. And the compromise that always comes up is that if players are going to have free agency, owners have to have a salary cap, because there's an overall fear by owners that salaries are going to get too out of control, and that if these salaries keep increasing with no end in sight, the small market teams are going to be forced out of the league and have no chance at survival. So, the purpose of salary cap, like I said, typically deals with money. Now, a lot of people say, and myself included, it literally looks to save owners money. And there's a lot of evidence of this based on the fact that a lot of times when the owners lock players out, It's based on the percentage of revenue that's going to the players as opposed to going to the owners. And if it wasn't about saving money, I don't think that this would be the direct response to free agency every time it came up in any major sport. But the fact that anytime free agency comes up in a major sport, a salary cap seemed to be the counteroffer. It really says that money is the issue. However, what owners would like us to believe is that it promotes competitive balance. And whether or not that's true, we have to take a little bit more, look at what's going on. So, in order to see if salary caps actually promote competitive balance, we're going to do two case studies, like I said earlier. The first one's going to be on the NFL, which we all know uses a salary cap, and the second one's going to be on the MLB, which uses no salary cap. So we'll go to the NFL first. The National Football League introduced free agency and the salary cap in 1994, and the chart you can see on your screen is a salary cap formula. So basically what the salary cap is, what they do is they project the overall revenue based on all teams in the league. And then based on the CBA, or the collective bargaining agreement rather, whatever percentage they've agreed to is the amount that they go with for the salary cap. So in this instance, on this formula, they've agreed to 62% of all the revenues going towards players' salaries and going to players in general, right? So they multiply the total projected by the agreed percentage to get the overall player share. And then they divide this by the amount of teams involved, in this case 30, to find the salary cap per team number. So every year the salary cap is going to be increasing. The salary cap isn't static. It's not going to stay the same. As revenue increases, the salary cap is going to increase as well. But at the same time, if revenue decreases, that salary cap is going to decrease at the same time. They have a positive relationship between the two of them. They move in the same direction because one is a percentage of the other. So it's interesting to note that over the last 20 years or so since the salary cap actually got implemented, it's grown about 7% per year. But more recently, it's been growing less, and some years even going backwards in terms of negative growth. So whether it be due to a weak economy or because revenues have just maybe leveled off and they're out of their growth period, the salary cap doesn't look to be changing much going forward. So on your screen now, you'll see two charts. And on the left, we're going to see the effects of what the salary cap actually did and what free agency did for players. So you'll see in 1993 to 1996, the amount of average salary per player and how much their salary changed. So when they went from one team to another one, on average they were making about 50% more than they were from the team they were at before. And on the chart on the right, what you can see is the football actual expenditures. This is what I was talking about earlier with the soft cap. The NFL is a soft cap system. So as you can see, on the right, the salary cap was $37.5 million, but plenty of teams spent way more than that. In fact, only one team was at the salary cap, and that was the Green Bay Packers. Every single team below them on that chart spent more money due to the bonuses system that we saw before. In Table 3, you can see the average salary and the average signing bonus, and you see how these teams were able to manipulate contracts to get within that so-called hard cap, but now we can look back and see that it was actually a soft cap. But what free agency and mobility of services did was allow these players to go off and make so much more money than they actually did. But we have to look at whether or not this improved mobility, this improved salary, the salary cap promoting competitive balance actually did promote competitive balance. So what we're going to do is, I've looked at the last 13 or 14 years of playoff statistics, and every team's got the same salary cap, so they have the ability to spend the same amount of money each and every year. So for the last 13 years, on average, there's been 6 new teams in the playoffs every single year. That's half of the teams involved, meaning that half the teams involved in the playoffs were not in the playoffs the prior year. So from first look, this statistic is going to say, wow, that's pretty balanced. The fact that you've got half of your teams competing for a championship this year that weren't competing for it last year says that there's a lot of balance, there's a lot of ability to go from a bad team to a good team fairly quickly. But we need to do a little bit more investigation, right? So at most, there were 7 new teams one year, and at least there was 4 new teams the year before. But like I said before, these are just blatant numbers. So we have to look at who actually wins the championships. So in the 13 years that we looked at for the previous statistic of 6 new teams on average, only 7 teams have won the Super Bowl. Now, that's because the Patriots have won it 3 times, the Ravens have won it twice, the Giants have won it twice, and the Steelers have won it twice, with a couple people winning it one time in that mix. But overall, you've seen dominance of a few teams. So pretty much half of the Super Bowls have been won by the same team, or at least half the teams involved have won multiple Super Bowls in that 13 years. So we have to wonder whether or not it's actually as balanced as we'd like to believe. While there's a lot of new teams in the playoffs every year, it doesn't mean they're actually winning, and ultimately, in sports, the whole point of the game is to win the championship. But while we have all these new teams in the playoffs, we don't have all these new teams winning the Super Bowl. And what makes it even more interesting is the disparity between the NFC and the AFC. In the AFC, over that 13-year period, the AFC was represented in the Super Bowl by only 5 teams. So over 13 years, only 5 teams from the AFC represented. That was the Ravens, the Patriots, the Steelers, the Colts, and the Raiders. Right? And barring the Raiders, all those teams were in at least 2 Super Bowls or more. On the NFC, however, over that 13-year period, there was 10 different teams involved. So now we have to look at, yes, there are a lot of teams involved from the NFC side, but from the AFC side, not so much. So how balanced is it really? It doesn't seem as balanced as we'd like to believe, but we have to wonder if that's because of the salary cap at all. There's definitely some different factors to play in. Well, one of the major things is the reverse draft order, and that's the sense that says that if you were the worst team in the league, you were going to have the first overall draft pick, and if you're the best team in the league, you're going to have the 32nd overall draft pick, or the last one of each round. And what this does is allows the worst team to get the best player in hopes that they'll be able to turn around very, very quickly. A lot of evidence has shown that this has done a lot to really allow teams to turn around very quickly if they draft well. And another thing with compensation of players, and a lot of other leagues, if a free agent player leaves your team for another one, the team that lost the player can get as much as a first-round draft pick for losing that player or players in return. The NFL does a similar type of system, but it's not quite the same. The compensation isn't nearly as good, and in sports like baseball, where the team that signed the free agent would actually lose their pick, in the NFL, no one loses a pick. Some teams are just granted new ones. So we're going to look next at the MLB, who has no salary cap at all. Now, the MLB has no salary cap, but you could say they have some type of system in place to try to promote competitive balance. And what that system is going to be the luxury tax. The luxury tax essentially says that if you spend more than a certain amount of money, you're going to have to pay a tax that's going to go towards player funds. Now, in this case, you can see on the screen that there's penalties involved, and based on how many consecutive years you've gone over the limit. So in the MLB, the actual limit is going to be $175 million. And if you go over it one time, you get a 17.5% penalty on your overall payroll for the team. 2 years, 30%, 3 years, 40%, and 4 years, 50%. Now, it's interesting to note that this type of, a lot of people think that this luxury tax, all these revenues that come from it go into the revenue sharing system, meaning that the big teams or the high payroll teams are going to be paying the low payroll teams essentially a stipend for not carrying as much of a payroll. However, it doesn't go into revenue sharing at all. It actually goes into about 75% of this luxury tax goes into player benefits, and the other 25 goes into industry growth, which means essentially marketing, trying to get developmental leagues going, furthering the amount of funding for young people playing baseball, ultimately trying to get more talent into the league, as quickly as possible, essentially. So, of the luxury tax, typically only a couple teams have to pay this every year. It's not very common, actually. The Yankees have seemed to pay it every single year since its inception, but that's just the way the Yankees are. They've paid it every single year So much so that 92% of the total amount paid since the inception of the program has been paid by the New York Yankees. So we have to look at whether or not this payroll for the Yankees has really paid off for them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the playoffs in 2013. We're going to look at overall payrolls of all the teams in the 2013 year, overall player salaries, and then look at the championships and who's won based on salary. So we'll start out by looking at the 2013 and how the salaries affect the balance. So as you can see from our chart on the screen, or from the PowerPoint rather, the Los Angeles Dodgers were the highest paid team in the playoffs, but they weren't number one. The Yankees were number one, but they missed out, and the Phillies were number three, but they missed out as well. As you can see, 7 of the top 10 teams in terms of player salaries were not in the playoffs. And what that says to me is that you can't necessarily buy your way into the playoffs, and you can't buy yourself a championship. The fact that 7 of the top 10 paid teams aren't in the playoffs says as much. If you could buy a championship, like people always like to blame on the Yankees, you would typically probably see maybe 8 or 9 of those top 10 teams in the playoffs every single year, but we don't. We actually see half of the playoff teams in the bottom 45% of the league in terms of payroll. As you can see at the bottom of the chart, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Oakland A's, and the Tampa Bay Rays were 26, 27, and 28 respectively, right at the bottom of the league, yet they were still competing for a championship. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the overall payroll of each and every MLB team in the league. And what you'll see is that you have the Phillies, you have the Angels, you have the Giants, you have the Texas Rangers. You have these teams that have competed in the last 10 years or so, but they're still not competing on a yearly basis. And it just further supports the evidence that you cannot buy a team. On the chart below this one, you'll see the top 10 highest paid players. And this really emphasizes the fact that it really is a team game, because if you look at the chart, 8 out of those 10 guys weren't playing baseball, come end of September. They weren't in the playoffs, they were sitting at home on their couch. So not only does a high salary not guarantee a championship, but one really expensive player can't get you into the championship. It's not necessarily going to get you a championship just because you have an Adrian Gonzalez, or you have an Alex Rodriguez, or because you have a Vernon Wells or Mark Teixeira. One guy is not going to be enough to get you over the hump. Now, we have to ask ourselves how history has looked in terms of people winning championships in their overall payroll. Well, on the next slide, you'll see a nice chart given to us by the New York Times that shows what the payroll ranking was and who won the championship in that year. Over the 15-year period from 1995 to 2010, you can see that only 4 out of the 15 years was the championship won by the highest paid player or highest paid team. There are 2 other years where Boston was the second highest and they won, but for the most part, you see teams at more like the bottom or the middle of the pack in terms of payroll winning the championship. So what this tells me is that it's not necessarily doing a whole lot in terms, or the salary cap's not necessarily doing a whole lot in terms of competitive balance, because you have the NFL where 7 teams have won it in the last 13 years, and you have the MLB where you have 10 different teams winning it in the past 15 years. So you could almost say that the MLB is more competitive than the NFL because more teams have won it in about the same amount of time. But that doesn't go against any type of logic that we ever heard, right? How could a salary cap be worse for competitiveness than no salary cap? Well, it's like it is for pretty much any issue. There's rarely one thing that determines anything. There's a lot of other factors that come into play. And in the MLB, it's similar to the NFL and says maybe the compensation style is different. Whenever you lose a good free agent in the MLB, a lot of times you get the other team's draft pick or their first round draft pick as compensation. And secondly, there's a lot of farm teams in the MLB. A lot of teams spend a lot of money developing guys. They draft, almost 3 or 4 times as many rounds as the NFL does, way more than the NBA does. So you have a lot of development going on that allows these small teams to really compete each and every year. Just the way they go about doing it is differently. You have some teams go out and spend a lot of money on proven veteran guys, and then you have other smaller teams that spend a lot less money on developing their guys, but both systems actually work. And what I feel like is you've allowed the market to basically figure out solutions on how to compete. Instead of giving a salary cap and dictating that certain teams play a certain way by spending as much money as they can to get to that cap and then going forward, they allowed each team to figure out what works best for them and go. So, as we've seen from the two case studies, salary caps don't necessarily promote competitive balance at all. So, what do the experts have to say? Well, the experts have to say is I've looked at a study from Middle Tennessee State where they used a lot of different metrics to look at how salary caps affect competitive balance in major sports. And what they found is that typically salary caps actually hurt competitive balance. What they did was find winning percentage and the standard deviation from the overall average, and found that after leagues had implemented a salary cap, the standard deviation grew, and they weren't nearly as consistent in terms of improving and competing on a yearly basis as they were before the salary cap. And what they always like to reference back to is the Coase theorem. And what it says is that if team owners are profit maximizers, which we can assume that they are, it says that whoever values a commodity, in this case a player, the most, is going to go after them and spend the most money because they're going to get the most value out of having them. So whether it means that a small market team needs one player that they feel can really get them over the hump, they'll go out and spend as much money as they can to get these guys. But at the same time, you have these big market teams spend a lot of money on stars. We have to look at why they do that. For instance, the New York Yankees are in a huge market. They have a ton of fans, they have a ton of merchandise, they have their own TV station, and they have to bring in a lot of stars to make sure that they can maintain the viewership of their station, maintain the sales of their tickets, maintain the sales of their fan base, and keep them happy, because if they don't have these stars, they have a lot more to lose than, say, a small city team like the Tampa Bay Rays or the Kansas City Royals. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say that it would be my recommendation to not have any salary caps in sports at all, because as their case studies have shown, they don't help, and they've been further backed up by scientific evidence by economists doing studies that found that salary caps actually hurt the competitive balance of teams. As we all know from all of our principles classes, salary caps and salary floors are going to create deadweight loss, and by being in these types of agreement, we're not letting the market do its job. If the market were doing its job, it would allow players to move freely. It would allow buyers and sellers to be met at one spot where they could have positive sum games. But instead, they're being restricted by caps, by floors, by contract stipulations that don't allow them to leave for the first 4 years of their career. So ultimately, my recommendation would be to get rid of salary caps and allow the market just to do its job. And I think we'd see a lot more competitiveness in sports as teams figured out the best way to win for them. Thank you.